This is a 1971 DeTomaso Pantera, and it's awesome. It looks absolutely fantastic, beautiful and striking and truly special. It's also thrilling to drive and very rare. And today I'm going to review this Pantera, one of the stars of the 1970s, and show you all of its quirks and features. Before I get started, big news, this Pantera is currently for sale and it's being auctioned live on Cars and Bids. That's a huge deal because Cars and Bids hasn't typically offered older cars before, but we're branching out and we're starting with a bang. This Pantera is one of the first older cars that you can buy on Cars and Bids. So once you finish watching this video, click the link in the description below to visit the live auction for this Pantera, where you can bid on it and buy it only on Cars and Bids. All right, time for the quirks and features of the Pantera, and let's start with the basics because this car has an interesting and rather quirky history. So, DeTomaso, the brand, was named for its founder, Alejandro DeTomaso, who was born in Argentina but spent most of his adult life in Italy. Now, he founded the DeTomaso automobile brand and started making race cars and then eventually road cars beginning in the 1960s. And at its highest, most successful peak, DeTomaso also owned Maserati and the Italian motorcycle brand Moto Guzzi. But despite DeTomaso's storied and unusual history, it's probably most known for this car, the Pantera, which indeed was named after the Italian word for panther. So let's talk Pantera. This car went into production in 1971 in Italy, and this is a 1971 model, a relatively early car. Now, the Pantera used a mid-mounted Ford V8, and although these cars were sold for a pretty long period of time, in fact, into the 1990s, believe it or not, they always used a Ford V8. In fact, at one point, Ford even became involved with the DeTomaso brand in the Pantera, and these were even sold in their early years at Ford dealerships here in the United States. More on the Ford DeTomaso history later. For now, this particular car has a 5.8-liter Ford Cleveland V8, which made about 330 horsepower, somewhere in that realm. And when you open up this rear hatch, you can see the big old school Ford V8 that powered this car. Now, you can also see a relatively large amount of empty space in here, which is kind of interesting. Some Pantera models had like a trunk area where you could put stuff, but a lot of them didn't, including this one. You can see there's nothing here but engine and mechanical components in this rear compartment. Now, this car has a 5-speed manual transmission like all Pantera models did throughout its entire production run. That was the transmission used. And of course, these cars used rear-wheel drive, which was the standard of its day. Now, one interesting thing in the engine compartment area is the fuel filler. You can see it's located right here. You have the DeTomaso logo on top of it, but you can't actually access it unless you open the rear lid. There's no like cutout or hole for the fuel filler. Now, that made the car more attractive on the outside. You didn't have to have a fuel door, ugly, poking through a body panel, but it meant that every time you filled the car with fuel, you had to open this rear compartment just to get fuel in, which was kind of interesting. Thankfully, it was easy to open. You just have this little button you push on the back with a keyhole, you push it, it pops right open, and then you can fill it with fuel. But despite that design flaw with the fuel door and the engine lid, this car is actually a masterpiece of design. It is a truly beautiful car, absolutely gorgeous lines. I think both wonderfully restrained and also incredibly exciting and thrilling to look at. It really is an amazing, exotic, special car, and I think the design was absolutely flawlessly executed. It really is nice. Now, this car was designed by Tom Charta, who also created some other important and special cars, including the very first version of the Ford Fiesta, which of course went on to be a massive, globally popular car, and an early 1960s Fiat Spider, which was also a beloved sports car. Now, Tom Charta also designed the La Forza, that weird late 80s SUV thing. So, he had some high points and he had some low points, but he will probably always be most remembered for designing the Pantera, which really is a very clean, beautiful, exotic sports car design. And it's a good example of a clean integration of the ugly US bumpers that plagued so many European cars in this era. You can see they're not perfectly integrated into the bodywork, but they don't stick out like a foot like they did in so many other cars. Porsche, Mercedes, Ferrari. This car was actually pretty well integrated with those ugly bumpers. Now, when Tom Charta designed this car, even though he was an American, he was working for Ghia, which is a famous Italian design house, and so this car has a Ghia badge on the front fender to commemorate Ghia's design of the car. In terms of badging, the other interesting emblem is this one. That's the DeTomaso logo, and the colors are familiar if you know the Argentine flag. Like I said, the founder, Alejandro DeTomaso, was born in Argentina, and even though this car was built in Italy and conceived in Italy and he was living in Italy, he did a little callback to the Argentine flag with the DeTomaso logo, which is why it has those colors. Now, as for interesting exterior quirks, speaking of badging, probably the most unusual badge is up front. You can see there's not one in the very front of the car. Instead, you have to look way under the car, and you can see it's mounted on the grille, which makes sense, except in this car, the grille is pointed down and no one's really ever going to see it. Doesn't make any sense. The badge, of course, should have been mounted up on the top, but that's just not what they did. Now, another interesting quirk of this particular Pantera is the mirror situation. You can see the holes in the doors where the mirrors should be, but this car has aftermarket mirrors that have been added to like the front quarter window on each side. Now, the factory mirrors were not particularly useful as mirrors, and so these aftermarket ones, they don't look that great. They're not period correct, but they're certainly more useful if you actually want to see behind you, which could be a goal of mirrors. Now, one other interesting item is around back. You can see the engine lid and then, of course, the passenger compartment in front of it. It's separated by glass, but it isn't where you'd think. The rear window is not mounted directly next to the engine lid, but instead all the way forward, basically right behind the passenger compartment and the seats. Now, the reason for that is they wanted to keep this area open because it's important for heat dissipation. And you can see there's actually like a grill here where the engine can give off excess heat. Obviously, if you put a window in that space, it would trap the heat and it wouldn't really solve the problem. So instead, you have this kind of unusual open area and the glass pulled more further forward than you might expect if you just give this car a quick look. But anyway, next up, we got to climb inside the Pantera. You open up the door and you can see the interior of the door panel is kind of cool. You have this sort of arrow pointing graphic look with the stitching, and you also have a pretty simple door panel interior treatment consisting of a handle to close the door and then a latch to open the door, sort of hidden in place, and then behind that a little storage compartment where you can put stuff. It's all a pretty simple, basic interior door panel, but it looks kind of cool and kind of characteristic of a special car from this era, and that's also true of this interior. You look around here and you can see this interior is honestly pretty expected for this car. It has kind of a cool look to it with the center console sort of splitting and going out to the sides, but generally it looks like a sports car from the 70s probably would. Sort of low, small seats with not much support and some controls in the center. It's a pretty predictable interior for this car. Nonetheless, it does have some rather interesting quirks, as you might imagine, and we begin with the gear lever. Now, I mentioned this car has a 5-speed manual transmission, and it's a gated 5-speed manual with a dog leg first, meaning that first gear is down and to the left rather than up and to the left like in so many other cars. Now, instead, up and to the left is reverse, so you don't want to make that mistake. Go for first gear and instead accidentally shift into reverse. There is no lockout, although it's slightly further over, so in theory you'll remember not to do that, but you could imagine some damage happening if you're not careful. Now, one interesting thing about this transmission, even though it's a traditional gated manual like a lot of exotic cars from this era had, the shaft of the gear lever isn't cylindrical like it is in so many cars. Instead, it's sort of rectangular, and so are the shift gates to shift into. And so instead of like this cylindrical shaft that you're shifting between the gates, gates, you're putting basically a rectangle into rectangular gates. It's not that different from normal gated manual cars, but it's a little different, and actually I think it's kind of cool for being different. It's sort of an interesting experience if you're used to shifting regular gated manuals. Now, one of the first things you notice, one of the quirkiest things about this interior, is the mounting point of the stereo, the position. You can see it's mounted vertically, even though it was clearly designed to be mounted horizontally. Now, the reason for this is DeTomaso obviously just used an off-the-shelf available stereo head unit part, which most other cars had mounted horizontally, but they didn't have the space in this interior for that, so they just took the horizontal stereo head unit and mounted it vertically and said, what the hell, let's just go with it. Now, above that, you have your climate controls, as you can see. Pretty obvious sliders for stuff like the floor and the defroster, or in-car and the defroster, that kind of stuff. My personal favorite climate control, though, is off to the right, where you have a little dial that gives you several options. There's off, and then there's cool, and then there's coolest. There's no warm option on this dial, just two different levels of cool. You have cool and coolest. You're in a Pantera, you would set that thing to coolest and just cruise. Now, interestingly, this is not the end of your climate controls. You also have a few climate fan controls over here on the left part of this center control stack. You can see one upper and one lower, which corresponds to their fan position. Strangely, these are interspersed with other controls, like the power window switches and some sort of light control, just sort of randomly placed along with your climate control fans, which are not near the other climate controls, but such was interior layouts in the 70s. Now, in this area, you can also see a vertical row of gauges, pretty typical stuff in here: battery voltage, fuel, water temperature, etc. All the usual stuff you'd expect to be sort of in between your vast array of climate controls. And by the way, one interesting other thing about those climate controls, despite having so many different options for climate, you only had two in-car interior climate vents. You can see right here in the middle, that's all you got. Now, obviously, there are also a vent to blow on the windshield to defog or defrost it, and then maybe some at your feet. But in terms of actual interior climate vents, you only had those. Now, next we move into the gauge cluster area, and you can see the gauges are pretty standard fare for this era. Obviously, you have a speedometer on one side, a tachometer on the other. Interestingly, they are separated, and in the middle is just one single red light, which looks very ominous. That is like in a more prominent position than the actual speed tachometer itself. I would be terrified of what happens if that red light were to come on. Now, one thing I really like over in this vicinity is the steering wheel. Obviously, they didn't have airbags in this era, but they knew that if you hit your head on a hard steering wheel, it could cause problems. So this one is rubberized, and it's sort of like pliable, pushy little rubber, sort of like you would see on a bumper car steering wheel. Some cars in the 70s did have this sort of rubbery feel like a bumper car steering wheel, and this is certainly one of them, and it's kind of comical to see now. Now, over to the left of the steering wheel, as you can see, you have your windshield wiper control over here, and also your hazard lights, a button that says hazard on it, which is kind of novel by today's standards, where you have that universally accepted triangle logo. Obviously, this car came before that was mandated, and so that is how you turn on the hazard lights in your Pantera and other similar cars from this era. Now, also in this vicinity, if you go back over to the door panel, you can see a little circle that's mounted on the door panel, which would be for your window roller, your window crank to roll the window down. Except this particular car had power windows, like I showed you before in the center control stack. That's where your power window controls are. So there was no need for a crank window, but instead of redesigning the door panel and just removing that, well, you still see a vestige of crank window left in this car. By the way, one other important interior item to mention, in the center console, you of course had a cigarette lighter and ashtray. Even though this car is relatively low on creature comforts by modern standards, in the 70s, you couldn't live without those items. Now, also here in the center console, you can see a little storage compartment, a little storage tray located in here where, of course, you could put stuff. This interior is actually relatively sparse on storage. You don't, for instance, have any storage behind the seats, which is where you usually would have some storage compartments in cars like this, but here they just didn't give you any. I suppose there's a little space back back there where you could stick stuff, but no dedicated storage compartment there. However, you did have the storage on the doors like I already showed you, and this car had a glove box, although its functioning was kind of unusual. There was no latch to open the glove box. Instead, you would keep the lid in place with this little screw that you could hand tighten or loosen, and when you loosened it, you could open up the screw and then get your glove box stuff. When you wanted it closed, you would actually have to screw it back in rather than just use a simple latch to open the glove box. Speaking of unusual placements, how about the parking brake, which is over on the passenger side of the interior? It's still in the middle in the center console where you'd expect it, but not on the driver's side, kind of an unusual spot, but that's what they've chosen to do. Now, one thing that is exactly where you'd expect it to be is the latch to get into the front compartment, which is located right here in the driver footwell. It's unusually large, this silver latch, but you pull it and it opens up the front. So what's up front in the Pantera? Well, once you unlatch the front compartment, you can just open it up, and then there's a prop rod where you can make sure that it sticks in place. And when you have it open, you can see it's a storage compartment up here. I mentioned that some Pantera models do have a trunk in the back over some of the engine, but if you didn't have that, you did have some extra storage up front where you could put some items, not exactly huge up here, but there's a little more storage than you might expect for such a relatively impractical looking car. Obviously, also located up here, there's some mechanical components. You can see the battery, fans, and various other items. But that's what's in your front compartment in the Pantera. So then you might be wondering, what happened? The DeTomaso Pantera. It's a beautiful car, striking, exciting, exotic car design like a Lamborghini or a Ferrari, big power, Italian build. How come we don't know DeTomaso like we know Lamborghini and Ferrari today? Well, here's the story. Like I mentioned, these cars in the US were sold through Ford dealerships in their early years. And in fact, Ford took an interest in DeTomaso and even took a financial interest in the DeTomaso brand, buying a big chunk of it in the early 1970s. But the fuel crisis then showed up along with emissions and pollutant controls, and Ford kind of lost interest in a high-performance Italian sports car brand, and eventually the two parted ways. DeTomaso didn't have a ton of money to create new, special, exciting cars, and they kind of peaked with the Pantera. They kept this car on sale all the way till 1992 in various iterations, trying to make it look cooler and more modern with big wings and body kits, and it just never really did it. But they tried to get it through the 80s and into the 90s that way. Overall, they built around 7,300 Pantera models throughout its 20-plus year production run. The early cars were definitely the most beautiful, and DeTomaso never really had a big hit like the Pantera ever again throughout its run. Now, over the years, this car has been prized. It is, after all, still a wide, low-slung, Italian-made exotic car, but it has never reached the values or the collector interest that similar cars have from better-known brands like Ferrari or Lamborghini. And frankly, at least from an enjoyment perspective, I think that's a mistake. This car is a very exciting one, a special, rare, really cool-looking car, and it also provides a pretty thrilling drive. Let's get behind the wheel and learn more about that. All right, driving the Pantera. I have never driven one of these in my life, but I have always admired the way that especially the early Pantera models look. I think they just look so cool. In fact, I think the design is a little bit more beautiful than my Countach. My Countach is much more striking and insane and crazy, but the general overall look of the car, the Pantera, is just, it's cleaner. It's not as striking, but it is just a more classically beautiful look in a really cool way. However, the real allegory to the Pantera and one of my cars is the Ford GT. I've always felt that this was the Ford GT of the 1970s. Mid-engine car, sold at Ford dealers with a Ford V8, designed by an American, manual transmission. Like, this is the Ford GT of its era. And so I drove my Ford GT into the office today to do a little mental comparison between the two. First thing you notice driving this car is obviously the seating position. The interior room is a little tight. I'm a taller person, of course, and people have told me that at 6 feet you start to have problems in this car. I'm 6'4" and I'm actually okay. Mainly, I think, because my height bias is primarily in my legs. My torso is sort of more normal size, strangely enough. I actually fit okay, but it's definitely tight. My head is right up against the headliner, but it's not really so bad. I've been in other cars from this era that are definitely worse. The Ferrari Boxer was a complete disaster in terms of ergonomics. The Countach is obviously pretty tight. This is exactly what I expected and not so bad. Next thing to note, I love the gated shifter, and it feels pretty cool to put like this rectangular shifter into the rectangular gates. Now, obviously, the really close comparison here would be a car like the Countach, sort of similar mid-engine, similar era, etc. And there are some similarities, although one big difference is the Countach just has simply more not only symphony, but drama in terms of its powertrain. The Ford V8 is cool, the Ford V8 is reliable with parts available, etc., and that's one of the reasons why they used it, and one of the reasons why this car was successful, rather than developing their own purpose-built engine. But the Ford V8 just doesn't have sort of the drama of a Lamborghini carbureted V12, or a carbureted, a Ferrari V12 from this era, that sort of thing. But this car is shockingly smooth. It actually feels more modern than I was expecting that it would, considering that it's an early 1970s car. Giving it some gas here, and whew, it's a blast. Good power. Good power, good power. Feels just as fast as my Countach, if not actually a little bit faster and a little bit more eager. It's a pretty fun car. Feels very light, and not light like the front end is light and I'm terrified, but just light like it moves pretty quick and you can move it pretty quick, and that's kind of fun. It feels surprisingly like tossable and little and move aroundable, which not every 70s car does. This was the era of big steel and metal, and not every car from this era really came out feeling kind of tossable and dynamic, but this one does more than I was expecting. It's actually a pretty cool car to drive, which is neat. The thing I love about the Countach and the thing I love about this car is, yeah, they're not that fast by modern standards, but in the days when, electric cars have taken over so much in terms of performance, it now becomes about the feel and the experience. And this car with the big V8 behind you, slotting it into gear with the big sound, this is an experienced car. And the experience is pretty damn cool. It sounds good, it looks good. I really am surprised by how smooth and easy this car is to drive. Like, really legitimately surprised by that. It is a pretty good driver car to actually have fun with. This car is nice. It's actually pretty fun to drive and to use, and I'm kind of shocked. I've always wondered about Panteras. You see them at car shows here and there, and I've always kind of wondered, what are they like? How do they actually drive? How do they operate? The answer is they're actually pretty fun. And it's interesting when you consider where this car is in terms of values relative to Countach's and Boxers and other cars. The only thing that holds it back is its name, DeTomaso. It's not Ferrari, it's not Lamborghini, and so people don't kind of give it the respect and the admiration that it deserves. But from a driving standpoint, it's a pretty exciting car. Obviously, it doesn't have the big V12, it doesn't have the Italian name, but it's an Italian-built, exciting car that looks really cool, and it's kind of a bargain version of one of those really, really special cars that are out of reach financially for so many people. And so that's the DeTomaso Pantera and the beginning of older car auctions on Cars and Bids. This is a very special car, absolutely gorgeous, striking to look at, and very exciting to drive, surprisingly so. And while this car is often overlooked because it isn't a Ferrari or a Lamborghini, it still has a lot of the right stuff, and you can get this one on Cars and Bids. Anyway, now it's time to give the Pantera a DougScore. And the DougScore is here, 52 out of 100, which puts the Pantera here against some sort of similar cars. It beats out the Ferrari Boxer, which may just be sacrilege, but truthfully, I thought the Pantera was smoother, better built, and definitely more comfortable and reasonable inside. And the Pantera's value proposition is basically unmatched, as I think the market still doesn't appreciate it for just how special it is.